What's up, everybody? This is the Hedge Mage, and welcome back to another video. So, another month has come and gone. So, today we're going to be taking a look at how the pauper metagame has been shifting over the last few weeks. So, we'll be taking a look at a bunch of decks today that all got first place at an in-person tournament. So, yes, all these decks were played in paper. Before we get any further, if you would like to support the channel, if you could leave a like on this video and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate that. And with that said, let's get into it. All right, and the first deck that we're taking a look at is Dea Suo by Shiba Yusei. Basically, what we're going to be taking a look at here is it Terror? Which, as of recording this video, the only Terra deck that's been listed as Tier 1, at least on mtgdex.net, was Is It Terror, which we've also seen a kind of last month we saw a little crossbreeding of both Demir and Is It Terror kind of coming together, making Grixis Terror. We kind of went over a list like that, and Demir Terror also seeming to shifting more towards a similar plan to Is It Terror. But yeah, let's take a look at what's going on in this deck. So we got 13 creatures here. We got 4 Augur of Bolas, something we've definitely seen a lot in the Esoteric list. 2 copies of Azure Fleet Admiral, and 1 copy of Crimson Fleet Commodore. I mean, before I think we've seen the decks leaning a little bit more heavy on the Commodore, and not really seeing the Admiral come up. So this is kind of interesting, but with things like a lot of decks running Monarch right now, especially decks more on the mid-range plan. Having the Azure Fleet Animal is a really good way to make sure you keep maintaining the Monarch, at least by having it on your end step every turn, since this card can become unblockable when another player has the Monarch, which is pretty nice. And then we also got 2 copies of Murmuring Mystic. This is just an incredibly good card in the format right now, and 4 copies of Tolarian Terror. So in the sorcery pile, we got 4 copies of Lorien Revealed, very good card, and 4 copies of Ponder. So sometimes I see decks running both Ponder and Preordain. This player seems to be just on the Ponder plan, which is great if you want to shuffle your library. So that can be pretty nice as well. All right, and then in their instant pile, we got 4 copies of Brainstorm, 2 copies of Breath Weapon. So interesting that they're running Breath Weapon over something like, I think it's Fiery Cannonade is the one that doesn't hit pirates, because they are running at least 3 pirates in their deck. Uh, one of one of them would die to the Breath Weapon, so that doesn't seem ideal. So interesting they're going with Breath Weapon over Fiery Cannonade here. And then we also got 4 copies of Counterspell, 4 Lightning Bolt, 1 copy of Loose Focus. Now, this is pretty interesting include here. Definitely very good against the Storm decks. I mean, something like Weather the Storm can really keep you from doing what you want to do or winning when you want to. So kind of interesting to include here. Lose Focus is definitely a very good card. We also got 4 copies of Scred. Uh, and 2 copies of Spell Pierce. So a lot of the usual spells that you would expect Is It Terror to be running. They are on an 18 land build with 1 Ash Barrens, 1 Maestro's Theater, 9 snow-covered island, 3 snow-covered mountain, and 4 volatile fjords. Alright, so yeah, basically all snow land builds trying to maximize their output with Scred, which is just an incredibly good removal spell in the format. Alright, that is their main deck. So in their sideboard, they brought in 3 copies of Abrade. Now, this isn't something I've really seen a lot of in Tier 1 lists. I definitely think Abrade is a very good card, especially for sideboards, as you can use it as removal for creatures or for artifacts. So it can come in against multiple decks. It is not just an affinity card, or it's not just a card that you would bring in against affinity decks or decks that run a lot of artifacts. You can also just use it bring it in if you want to have more removal against some of the more swarmy decks out there. So yeah, it's a pretty solid card. Though with I am like a little surprised not to see Cast in the Fire, as I just feel like exiling artifacts and being able to exile, indestructible lands is pretty good and definitely something I would probably be trying to do if I was playing Is It Terror, but still love seeing a Braid make the cut in any sideboard. We also got 4 copies of Blue Elemental Blast, 2 copies of Breath Weapon, so they'll go up to 4 board wipes against Koldatha, most likely. Probably do that against White Weenie as well, which is very, very good. I mean, and also just having instant speed board wipes is kind of what you need to really keep Koldatha from doing its thing, because that is a very aggressive deck that can win very, very early. And especially with a deck like this, you are a little bit slower and grindier. So yeah, the instant speed board wipes are very necessary. We also got 2 copies of Gorilla Shaman and 4 copies of Pyroblast. So a lot of the stuff that we have been seeing with Is It Terror in the past seems like a pretty solid list. If you'd be interested in playing this list, looks like it's going for around $126 right now. So a little bit on the high end for pauper decks, but still very much affordable compared to other formats. The next deck we're looking at is a Jessukai Burinku deck by Muto Yui. So Jeskai Blink, in other words. So we got Jeskai Ephemerate here. So let's take a look at what's going on in this Ephemerate list. Now, Ephemerate, at least on mtgdex.net, has been listed for a long time, for the past couple months, until recently as a tier 2 list, but now it seems like it's been getting a little bit more popular and getting, or just placing better in tournaments. So now it has been considered a tier 1 deck, which is pretty cool because I think this deck is really, really fun to play. So let's see what they brought here. So in the creatures, they have 13 creatures. We got 1 copy of Archaeomancer and also 1 copy of Ardent Elementalist. Okay, and we got 4 copies of Augur of Bolas, just a really solid creature here. It really helps you dig, and that 1/3 body is very, very good in the format. We got also 1 copy of Dawnbringer Cleric, 1 copy of Kenku Artificer, 4 Mull Drifter, and 1 copy of Murmuring Mystic. In their sorcery pile, they got 4 copies of Cleansing Wildfire. Now, this is a huge part of the deck, as you can basically use this to ramp yourself and draw cards for 2 mana by targeting one of your indestructible bridges. So, pretty great card. We also got 4 copies of Lorien Revealed and 2 Preordain. So, in the instant pile here, we got 3 Brainstorm, 1 copy of Breath Weapon, 4 copies of Counterspell, 4 Ephemerate. Seems really good, especially with all of the ETB effects to their Artificers, Mull Drifters, Clerics, the Bolas, the Archaeomancers, obviously, and the Ardent Elementalists, which they can basically use to just lock out the game. So Ephemerate really does some crazy stuff in this deck. It's kind of busted, to be honest. It's very, 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 very strong card. We also got 3 copies of Galvanic Blast and 2 copies of Lightning Bolt and 1 Spell Pierce. Now, Galvanic Blast isn't something that I was expecting to see here. Because, I mean, they do have, I mean, their bridges are artifacts, but I feel like it's going to be pretty hard to get Metalcraft here. Though, if they do have Metalcraft and they do have, 3 bridges out on the battlefield, I mean, this is definitely better than Lightning Bolt. Most of the lists I have come across have been on Lightning Bolts over Galvanic Blast. Still, Galvanic Blast is a very strong card if you do have Metalcraft. Alright, so it is on a 19 land build. So we have one copy of Ash Barrens, one Glacial Floodplain, 7 Island, one Mountain, one Plains, one Razor Tide Bridge, two Rustvale Bridge, four Bluff Bridge, and one Volatile Fjord. I think in other decks I've seen, they've been on a Snowland build running Skred. So interesting to see here that this deck is not on the Skred plan or just the Snowland build. We do have a couple Snowlands, but I think that is mostly for flavor with this player. Is I also like running some of the Snowlands just for flavor, especially the dual ones, as they are just very beautiful looking cards. All right, so in the sideboard, we got three copies of Blue Elemental Blast, another copy of Breath Weapon, one Cast into the Fire, one more Dawnbringer Cleric, a Dispel, and a copy of Fiery Cannonade. So, post sideboard against Koldatha, they'll bring in basically, it looks like three board wipes, which they can also get their board wipes back with their Elementalists and their Archaeomancers, so that is pretty cool, especially if Koldatha stabilizes and, you know, gets a board presence again, though usually that's can be a little hard for them to do after they basically played out their hand and you've just swept their board. Then we also got two copies of Gorilla Shaman, another copy of Murmuring Mystic. This is such a good card to bring in against the fairies or Dimir fairies or blue fairies. And there are still some people out there playing mono blue fairies. And it's as much as people would probably like to argue against it, it's still a very solid deck and can really catch you with your pants down if you are not careful. So Murmuring Mystic, but Murmuring Mystic is just such a huge nerf against the fairies decks, whether it's Dimir or Mono Blue or even Izzet, which does get played a bit as well. So yeah, so really good card against them is as soon as this resolves, there's really not going to be much they're going to be able to do. All right, we also got two copies of Pyroblast, one copy of Relic of Progenitus, and another Spell Pierce. So they have a lot of different things that they can bring in from their sideboard for a variety of matchups. So yeah, seems like a pretty good deck, and as far as pauper decks go, this one is kind of on the cheap side, around $89. So this deck is under $100 if you would want to play it. And I think it looks pretty solid. It definitely got first place in a tournament, so that is pretty cool. And the next deck we're looking at is UB Fate deck by Alessandro Leone, and I'm assuming it was just a typo here because it's basically Demir Fairies, so I'm guessing it's supposed to be UB Fae. All right, so Demir Fairies. Let's see what our friend Alessandro brought for Demir Fairies. They are on 18 creatures. We got four copies of Augur of Bola, so this is definitely one card that we are seeing a ton of in a lot of decks right now. Augur of Bolas is just such a good card. And we also got three copies of Fairy Seer, one Gurmag Angler, one copy of Murmuring Mystic, three Ninja of the Deep Hours, four copies of Spellstutter Sprite, and two copies of Thorn of the Black Rose. Okay, in their sources, we're running one copy of Extract a Confession. Now, this is a card that I kind of have mixed feelings of. It's definitely something you have to build around a bit, just because you're gonna, if you don't have that enough cards to collect evidence, this card doesn't really do much. It's kind of just ends up being a worse Chainer's Edict since it doesn't have flashback. But if you are able to collect evidence, this is going to get rid of like a really big creature with a bunch of auras on it, like if you're going up against Bogles or Mono White Heroic, for example, or if you're just going up against All That Glitters, I mean, that is going to be their biggest creature as well. So Extract a Confession is really good. It is a sorcery though, so that is, I think, its biggest downside is you may end up getting hit in the face with a bunch of damage. However, they will probably also have played out their hand, and getting rid of their big baddie is gonna really help turn the game in your favor. All right, and then we got 4 copies of Lorien Revealed and 2 copies of Preordain. So in their instance, we got 1 Agony Warp. So this is really good, especially against decks that are running Guardian of the Guild pack, as you can kill a Guardian this way. Also, 1 copy of Behold the Multiverse, 3 copies of Brainstorm, 2 Cast Down, 4 Counterspell, 1 Dispel in the main, and that's pretty interesting. Dispel does hit a ton of stuff in the format, so that's kind of cool. 1 copy of Echoing Decay. So a 2 mana board wipe. Now this card is actually really good against Ktha Red, as a, they do get a bunch of cards with the same name through Ktha Rebirth, especially if they played 2 of them. And then if they hit you with 2 Ktha Rebirths into a Goblin Bushwhacker, you can just basically take their turn away from them. Uh, just by doing this, I mean you can get rid of like at least 3 creatures with this card. Also, sometimes you might be getting hit with multiple Goblin Tomb Raiders, so getting rid of those, they also have toughness too, so that is also very good against them as well. And we also got 4 copies of Snuff Out. All right, in their mana base, we're on an 18 land build. We got 4 Contaminated Aquifer, 2 Demir Aqueduct, 10 Islands, 1 Obscure Storefront, and 1 Swap. With the Demir Aqueducts, though, I am a little surprised that we don't see anything with ETB effects like some Bojuka Bogs or Mortuary Mires, anything like that in the deck. As the Aqueducts seem like a little less good just as a tap land, you might as well just be running some Ice Tunnels, I believe, since you could fetch them with the Lorne Revealed. But yeah, 18 land build sounds good. All right, in the sideboard, we got 2 copies of Annul to bring it up in against probably all that glitters a lot, as that's the main flavor of Affinity that you're seeing right now, and 1 copy of Arms of Hadar, which is probably makes a lot of sense here, since a lot of your creatures, especially with your spell starter sprites, your fairy seers, they have 2 toughness. You also make a ton of birds with the Murmuring Mystic, so you don't want to necessarily board wipe yourself. But this will board wipe a lot of decks in the format, especially things like Ktha Red. Though if you survive long enough to get this to resolve against them, we'll see what happens. All right, and we got 4 copies of Blue Elemental Blast, 1 Dispel, 1 more Murmuring Mystic, 1 Okiba Gang Shinobi, 2 copies of Relic of Progenitus, 1 Stormbound Geist, and 2 copies of Unexpected Fang. So seems like a pretty solid sideboard and a pretty solid deck overall. This deck is a little bit on the pricey side for pauper decks, coming in around $126. Still seems like a very solid deck. And the next deck we're looking at is Ktha Red deck by Oshima Takumu. So let's see what they're bringing in for good Ktha Red, and this one is providing a little bit of variance for the archetypes. So we got some kind of spicy cards here. So 4 copies of Goblin Bushwhacker, which is something you are pretty much expecting with this deck. 4 Goblin Tomb Raider, just solid 1-drop, and here's the spice. So 4 copies of Halo Hopper. Now this card came out almost, I think, about a year ago almost. Hadn't really seen much play. There was a Convoke deck that did pop up for a little bit, but is kind of just faded into obscurity at this point. So kind of fun that we could see it here. And something I've often thought about with Ktha Rebirth. You know, it's 1 mana, you play Ktha Rebirth, you tap your 3 goblins, you play the Halo Hopper. Now all of a sudden you got 6 power on the board, possibly even on turn 1, which is pretty wild. So yeah, this card is, I think, definitely something to consider in your Ktha Red builds. I'm not sure if I'm gonna go this way, but it is definitely a choice. And we also got a new card here, 4 copies of Reckless Lackey. So definitely a pretty solid one drop. It has first strike and haste, so it's kind of like a raging goblin, but better as it's got a 1/2 body. You can also sacrifice this to draw a card and create a treasure token. So honestly does a lot for the deck. Though surprising, if they're running this card, we're not seeing things like Goblin Blast Runner, which has basically disappeared from this list. That's pretty wild. All right, and we also got 4 copies of Voldaren Epicure. So for the most part, pretty much what you expect to see in the creature pile for Koldatha. And we also have 4 copies of Goblin Grenade, which honestly makes me really happy. This card just brings me back to my younger days when I first started playing competitive Magic and I was playing mono red goblins, running 4 Goblin Grenades, 4 Lightning Bolts, 4 like, running Reckless Abandon or something like that. But yeah, love seeing Goblin Grenade pop up in lists. We also got, 4 copies of Koldatha Rebirth, since that is pretty much the namesake card of the deck. In the instance, we got 3 copies of Demand Answers. Now, this is a card I haven't really seen being played in Koldatha. Definitely is a very good 2 mana draw spell, as in this deck, especially, you have artifacts that you can sacrifice through, like, maybe it's a blood token. You can also just discard, maybe you're flooding out, you have extra lands that you do not need, since you really only need maybe at most 3 to 4 lands in this deck to really have it running optimally. So yeah, so you can discard that land you don't need. For in addition to paying this card's casting cost, so a great 2 mana draw spell, and also 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. So no Fire Blast. That's interesting. All right, and 4 copies of Experimental Synthesizer and 4 copies of Implement of Combustion. So the standard artifact package here. And we're on a 17 land build with this deck. We got 4 Great Furnace and 13 Basic Mountains. So in their sideboard, we got 4 copies of End the Festivities, 4 Pyroblast. Interesting, it's Pyroblast and not Red Elemental Blast, is without, Swift Spear being gone, there's not really much reason to be running Pyroblast specifically. Can definitely get away with running Red Elemental Blast if you're looking to build Koldatha Red yourself. Also running 4 copies of Reckless Airstrike. Now this is a card that I I don't think I've ever seen other Koldatha Red decks running as well. Definitely a pretty interesting card, as you can use it to kill a core Skyfisher with this. That's pretty cool because it's 3 damage to a creature with flying. Also can just, use it to kill fairies and the like. So that is also very, very good. So kills a lot of different flying creatures, honestly, for 1 red mana. Also can use it to destroy an artifact, and that is also very relevant in the format. Also, 3 copies of Tormod's Crypt. So definitely a bit of variance going on with this Koldatha deck, but still seems like a very solid deck. Obviously, it did get first place in the tournament, so gotta give credit where credit is due. And if you are interested in playing this deck, looks like it's going for around $95. Not so still under the $100 mark. So pretty good deck to if you want to get started in Pauper. Definitely a very easy deck to learn how to play. Next we have a Glitter Affinity deck by Kagimoto Genya. So we have Azorius Affinity. So something we've definitely been seeing a lot of in the meta for a while. Definitely one of the best decks out there. Oh, they're on a 24 creature build here with 4 copies of Ginger Brute, 4 Moon Circuit Hacker, 4 Mirror Enforcer, 4 Novice Inspector, and for Ornithopter, and for Thraben Inspector. So an 8 Inspector build, that's definitely seems where the deck has been going since Novice Inspector came out. Definitely seems to add a lot to the deck, as the clue token can, either up your affinity count or help you draw cards when you need to. So in the sorcery pile, we got 3 copies of One Mind and 4 copies of Thoughtcast. So pretty standard in terms of what we've been seeing for affinity decks. In their instance, we just have 4 copies of Metallic Rebuke. So, a very good card there. And 4 copies of Springleaf Gem, which is just a great card in the deck to help fix your mana. And of course, we have 4 copies of probably one of the most busted cards in the format currently, All That Glitters. Alright, and we're on a 17 land build. We got 4 copies of Ancient Den, 3 Darksteel Citadel, 2 basic islands, 4 Razor Tide Bridge, and 4 Seat of the Synod. So basically, we're on a 15 artifact land build with 2 non-artifact lands, bringing it up to 17. So that is a lot of artifact lands. They are definitely going to be hitting you pretty hard with the All That Glitters, and they definitely have, 8 creatures here that have evasion. So that is definitely pretty good with the 4 Ornithopters and the 4 Ginger Brutes. They're definitely going to be pretty hard to deal with this deck once they get all the glitters attached to an Ornithopter or a Ginger Brute. If you don't have a flying creature or a creature with haste, you're not going to be able to block that, and it's going to be a lot of damage coming at you. And if you don't have removal or interaction at the most optimal time, the game can be pretty over, since they can also just take over the game with Mirror Enforcer Brutes. Also, the great blockers with the 8 Inspectors they're running. So this deck really is a powerhouse right now. All right, and in the sideboard, we got 1 copy of Destroy Evil, 4 copies of Dust to Dust, 4 Hydroblast, 1 Obsidian Acolyte, 2 Relic of Progenitus, and 3 copies of Standard Bearer, which is just a great card for the mirror match with this deck. And if you are trying to get into competitive pauper, you will probably be going up against a very similar list. And yeah, the mirror match is mostly just a race, so Standard Bearer can really help you make sure that you are getting all the glitters and not your opponent if they happen to get it first. Okay. And so yeah, this deck is a little bit on the pricey side. So right now it's going for around $154. So probably one of the more expensive decks that we've looked at so far today. Yeah, so definitely it is an expensive deck. A huge portion of that, if you just look at the price here in the mana base, so just for the lands, 37.89. A lot of that has to do with the prices of Seat of Synod as well as Ancient Den. Ancient Den being like, you know, basically just $20 for a playset right now. It's gone up in price a lot, especially since this deck has done very well in tournaments as well as just being very, very popular. The next deck that we're looking at, everyone, is going to be Borboleta's deck by Moon William. So this is Golgari Garden. So let's see what they brought in their gardens list. We got 3 copies of Avenging Hunter, 3 Crypt Rats, 2 Thorn of the Black Rose, and 3 copies of Troll of Khazad-dûm. So a pretty standard creature creature pile for Golgari Gardens. All right, and we got no sorceries, so let's see. We got 20 instants here. We got 4 copies of Cast Down, 4 Deadly Dispute, 4 copies of Defile, 4 Fanatical Offering, and 1 copy of Reckoner's Bargain. So often I've seen kind of an even split with Fanatical Offering and Reckoner's Bargain. They're just doing 4 in this deck, or at least of the Fanatical Offering, which I think is pretty good because I honestly think the map tokens are really, really great for the deck as they just let you dig a little bit, trying to find that extra land or just by getting an extra counter on one of your creatures, which can be very pivotal sometimes. And we also got 2 copies of Snuff Out and 1 copy of Spinning Darkness. So in their artifact pile, we've got 11 artifacts. They got 1 copy of Blood Fountain, which is a pretty solid card for the deck. The blood token can be used to uh, cast things like Deadly Dispute or Fanatical Offering, or just use it to kind of dig through your deck as well when you have a dead card in hand. Also got 3 copies of Wellspring and 3 copies of Lembus. And we also 4 copies of Tithing Blade, just an amazing artifact that's entered the format somewhat recently. Often, I've won a lot of games playing Gardens just by transforming Tithing Blade into its other side, so you can ping your opponent at the beginning of each upkeep, which can be really, really good just to keep consistent damage, especially when your opponent is kind of fizzling out and in a top deck situation. You can just continually maintain pressure, especially if they've had answers for all of your big creatures. So yeah, this transforming this card can be really, really good in the late game. And on their mana base, they are an 18 land build with 1 Bojuka Bog, 1 Golgari Rot Farm, 1 Haunted Mire, 4 Colony Garden, 10 Swamp, and 1 Witch's Cottage. So pretty much all swamps outside of the 4 gardens and the Rot Farm and Bojuka Bog. So basically they can fetch any of these lands with their Troll of Khazad-dûm. Alright, in their sideboard, we got 1 copy of Dash Hopes. Now this card I haven't seen really being played in gardens. But honestly, love to see it. This is one card I've been kind of a pet card of mine, honestly, that I've really been wanting to try and work into decks. And maybe I'll work this card into Gardens now. Possibly. I've had a copy or two just sort of collecting dust in my collection and just really am just itching to play it just because, a black counterspell isn't something a lot of people see coming. And with how much pressure you can put on your opponent with a deck like Gardens, forcing them to either have to pay 5 life or have their spell countered, they will probably pay the 5 life, which will just work in your favor either way, or you get to counter their spell if they decline to do so. So Dash Help seems like a pretty good card, honestly. All right, and then we got 2 copies of Drown in Sorrow. Very good board wipe in the format. Only downside of it is sorcery speed, but you can basically wipe the board with a lot of swarmy decks, and with 3 copies of Duress, 2 copies of Fairy Macabre, 2 copies of Nihil Spellbomb, 1 Siphon Life. Now this card I've seen honestly popping up a little bit. A nice little burn spell for the deck. You can also retrace this by discarding a land, so you can do it multiple times and cast it from your graveyard, which is pretty wild. And you can, get a lot of lands with your Troll of Khazad-dûm. You also draw a lot of cards in the deck. So drawing into lands that you may or may not need really anymore, you can just kind of put more pressure on your opponent with this card. So that is pretty cool. And we also got 1 copy of Troublemaker Oof. Not a card I'm a huge fan of anymore, but still is a pretty solid card in this deck. And 3 copies of Weather the Storm. And this is a pretty budget-friendly deck if you're trying to get into competitive Pauper. Right now, this deck is going around for $78. Probably one of the cheapest decks I think we've looked at so far today. So definitely a deck I would highly recommend. It is a very grindy deck, but if that's your thing, you are absolutely going to love it. All right, and the final deck that we're looking at today is All That Glitters Boros deck by Museo Alessio, probably mispronouncing that. But anyhow, so on a lot of sites that collect tournament data, you may come across a tier one decks or a category for tier one decks being called Boros Synthesizer. But the decks that are winning, as much as I would love it to be more of the old school, not old school, but the tried and true Boros Synth mid-range pile, that is a deck that I do really love. It's actually just Boros Synthesizer pivoting towards an All That Glitters build and being more aggressive, which doesn't make me super excited, as I just do love the mid-range deck and just its play style. But hey, this is where we are in the format. All That Glitters, just if you have access to artifacts and to white mana, it's just the deck just kind of builds itself. But let's take a look at what's going on with this Boros Glitters deck. So we have 17 creatures here. We got 4 copies of Glinthawk, one Helioids Pilgrim. So this is a basically a tutor for all the glitters. So that's pretty cool. We also got 4 copies of Core Skyfisher, and 4 Novice Inspector, and 4 Thraben Inspector. So an 8 Inspector build here, and we got our 8 Bouncers with our Glint Hawks and our Novice Inspectors. So in our instance, we got 4 Galvanic Blast. Seems like a pretty much an auto include for something with access to red mana and a bunch of artifacts. This is a very easy 1 mana 4 damage spell, and 4 copies of Lightning Bolt. So in the artifact pile, we got 1 copy of Barbed Batterfist. Definitely a very solid artifact for, just Boros Synth in general. And then 4 copies of Experimental Synthesizer, the namesake card. And we got 3 copies of Lembas and 3 copies of Wedding Invitation. Well, this can kind of make this is a pretty interesting card. It is just a 2 mana draw spell, as well as you can just make a creature unlockable. And if it's a vampire, they gain lifelink. There's no vampires in this deck, so don't really care about that. However, just making whatever thing you could put all the glitters on one of your inspectors, make it unblockable, maybe swing for lethal or just about lethal. And then you can easily finish them off with lightning bolts and galvanic blasts. So, Wedding Invitation is definitely a very strong card in this type of build. In their enchantments, of course, we're going to see 4 copies of all the glitters, because that's what this deck is doing now, and 1 copy of Makeshift Munitions, which is basically a tried and true card of just the Boros Synth archetype, as even if all of your creatures have been removed and you have a bunch of artifacts out, which you probably are going to have with this deck, you can just kind of finish off your opponent with a bunch of activations of Makeshift Munitions. So yeah, it's pretty fun times there. And we're on a 19 land build here. So we got 3 copies of Ancient Den, 1 Boros Garrison, 3 Great Furnace, 2 Mountains, 4 Plains, 4 Rustvale Bridge, and 2 copies of Wind Scarred Crag. So interesting, we're not seeing the usual 12 artifact lands in this deck. They do make a ton of artifacts, just with all of their utility artifacts they have here, as well as the 8 Inspectors. And they also have an enchantment here with Makeshift Munitions, so that is going to increase the count on all the glitters. But yeah, interesting, we're not at the 12 artifact lands here. Also not seeing any Darksteel Citadels to try and increase their all the glitters count. So that is a pretty interesting choice. Definitely this deck did well in a tournament. So there's that. In the sideboard, we got 2 copies of Cast into the Fire. Very good card when you're going up against other affinity decks or just going up against fairies, as you can get rid of their 1/1s at instant speed. We also got 1 copy of Circle of Protection Black. Usually you see Circle Protection Blue to get around all the terrors and the Cryptic Serpents. But yeah, Circle Protection Black is very, very interesting. All right, and we also got 2 copies of Destroy Evil. Very solid sideboard card here. And 1 copy of Dust to Dust. And we got 3 copies of Gorilla Shaman. 3 Clan Shamans. Very good against the Ktha Red decks out there, as well as other decks that want to swarm you on the ground. And 3 copies of Relic of Progenitus. Oh, this card isn't, obviously is not the most expensive deck that we've taken a look at. If you're interested in playing this deck, looks like it's going to cost you around $118, give or take. So not the most expensive, not the least expensive as well. So I wouldn't necessarily consider this budget friendly, though compared to other formats. Pauper is a very, very budget friendly format to get into. But yeah, Boros Glitters, it's out there now. That's kind of what Boros Synth seems to be doing. I've also seen some other Boros Synth decks going more of a Kuldotha route as well. So that is pretty interesting too. But it seems that if Boros Synth wants to be competitive in the today's Pauper environment, you got to play all the glitters. That's going to do it for today's video. Thanks again from everyone who stuck around till the end. I will have links to all of the decks that we went over down in the description below if you want to check them out on your own time. But I would love to hear from you guys what you think of the current meta game as it is right now. Do you like the way that it is going? It definitely seems like any deck that wants to run all the glitters can be good, and to be honest, just the pattern of deck building for these type of decks I do find a little nauseating, as they just don't seem incredibly interesting to me. That's my own opinion. Let me know if you agree or disagree with that, or just your general thoughts on the metagame in general. As always, I hope you all are having a wonderful day, and I will see you all next time.